Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to Reading Culture. In the last video, we looked at Plato's allegory of the cave from his Republic, and we really looked at how that particular, you could call it a kind of philosophical myth, this allegory that helps us understand Plato's view of reality, but may also help us engage with literary works, which we will be looking at this year. It also perhaps is a work which focuses on the universals, right? The ideals of something, right? The form of the good for Plato, and possibly for us thinking about the ideal of heroism apart from an individual manifestation by a particular character in a particular work. Today, we're going to be looking at his student, Aristotle, and how some of the works of Aristotle will also be incredibly useful not only for analyzing literature more broadly in this class, but also particularly for our focus here at Reading Culture, namely the concept of the hero, heroism. So to begin with, a little bit about Aristotle and who he was. So as I mentioned, he was the student of Plato, and who was in turn, of course, the student of Socrates. So just to kind of frame this for you, you have Socrates, in many ways the beginning of Western philosophy, living in 470 to 399 before Christ. Going out into the streets, right, and dialoguing with people, right? It's called dialectic, right? You're asking questions to try and discover the truth. And what does Socrates say? He says, really foundational things for this Western idea of philosophy. Things like, the unexamined life is not worth living, or that the only thing that I know is that I do not know, right? This kind of questioning of knowledge. And really a questioning of one's suppositions. And of course, for this, as mentioned in the last video, he was ultimately condemned, accused of not believing in the gods and of corrupting the youth of Athens and put to death, forced to consume hemlock. His student, Plato, right, is then living around 428 to 427 BC to 348 or 347 BC. He is expanding upon the teachings of his teacher Socrates in his works like the Republic, and expanding on this idea of universals. Well, his student, that is Plato's student, Aristotle, living around 384 to 322 before Christ, he is in very many ways coming and building off of Plato and Socrates, but also going in a very different direction. If Plato is moving towards universals, Aristotle is moving towards particulars. So if you found the last exploration of Plato a bit too abstract, then Aristotle may be your guy, because he is going to be much more focused in on particular instantiations of things. Now we're going to apply that in this video to literature, and even specifically to the idea of the hero a little bit later on. But to begin with, and to again give some more contextualization for why he's even worth looking at. Along with Plato / Socrates, Aristotle is really the other foundational pillar of Western philosophical thought. Right? On Plato and Aristotle, all of our thinking in the West, in terms of philosophy, is really built on them. Even those who reject it are still having to deal with it in some way, even in order to reject it. But why is it important to look at Plato and Aristotle more broadly, insofar as literature exploration, say? Well, in terms of Aristotle, one of his primary important functions is the fact that he is the author of the Poetics. And the Poetics is really the text from which our entire tradition of literary criticism comes. It's in the Poetics that we have the first real example of someone critically and analytically looking at literary production and how we conceive of literature, how we categorize literature particularly. So one thing you may notice is that as we move along here in Reading Culture, we will be looking at series of texts which have been grouped together by genre. So we're beginning, for instance, with prose texts, short stories, essays, things of that nature. We'll then move to drama. We'll be looking at Shakespeare, for instance. And finally, we will be looking at poetry. These kinds of distinctions are distinctions of genre, right? And this goes back to Aristotle. And it's very important to think about genre because genre affects the content. Right? The very famous, now nearly cliche quotation from Marshall McLuhan, very important Canadian intellectual, is the medium is the message. Well, the medium is the means by which you are presenting whatever it is. So it could be on stage, it could be written down, it could be heard. And for Aristotle, this was a matter of categorization, right? That you would have, say, form or matter, right? Which is to say, what is the diction of the thing if it's written down? Does it have meter or rhythm? Is it melodic or musical? Can you accompany it with music? And you have the subject, you have the theme, the characters, the narrative, the plot. And then you have the mode. You could think of it as the mode of delivery, right? Is it orally narrated? Is it an imitative performance? Is it a sung narration or a sung performance? All of these things help to define what a piece of literature is. So, for example, a play, say Hamlet, right? The form or the matter of that is going to be, well, it's going to be words, but specifically it's going to be words which often have meter and rhythm. So you might seem like it is poetry. It is in a certain sense. The subject, right, the theme, the characters are going to be tragic. So they're going to fall into the categorization of tragedy. But the mode is going to be imitative performance. That is to say, it's meant to be performed, it's performative, which means it's drama. It's not simply a poem, right? These kinds of categorizations are going to help narrow in on the kind of literature that we're dealing with, right? So that we understand the difference between acting out something on a stage. If we're talking about a tragic hero on the stage, that might be different, possibly, from a tragic hero in literature. What is the difference, for instance, between finding out what a character thinks via a soliloquy or via actually having written down his internal thoughts, for instance? Which brings me to the next important contribution by Aristotle, which is namely, particularly for us, that he talks about this concept of the hero. Now, one of the primary ways in which he does this is by talking about the tragic hero, that is to say, the hero of tragedy. Now, one of the ways in which he does this is he sets apart the tragic hero from, well, the hero that is not tragic. You may have heard the term before, the tragic flaw. So you see, the tragic hero, while still being a hero in some sense, certainly in the sense of being the protagonist of a literary work, nevertheless has a flaw which causes him to come to grief in some way. So often, right, it is theorized that the tragic flaw of Hamlet is that he vacillates. Right? It is his indecision. It is his inability to either reject his ghostly father's plea to avenge him, or to immediately avenge his father on his uncle Claudius, that ultimately leads to the end of the play, where not only Hamlet dies, but as does his mother, and ultimately Claudius as well. This flaw is called in the Greek hamartia. Now, hamartia is often translated as sin, but it's not sin in the Christian sense. It really literally means to miss the mark, right? In other words, you should steer towards a particular mark to hit your target, and you've missed it. That is hamartia. Now, in order to place this in context, we have to talk about what is famously called the golden mean. Right? That is this idea of the difference between one virtue and a vice, and that the vices represent defect or excess, whereas the virtue lies right in the middle. So if you look at a table of these vices and virtues and their middle point, their golden mean, if you will, you will get a better idea of what we're talking about. So these are separated into spheres of action or feeling. So for instance, we have fear and confidence. So excess of fear and confidence, right, that causes you to just rush in foolishly, that's rashness. Whereas a deficiency is, of course, cowardice. But the virtue lies in the mean being courage. Now, perhaps some examples will help. So I'm going to suggest some examples of works which we will be looking at later. So you might not be able to fully unpack these at the moment unless you've already read these works. But even so, I would like you to, keep them in the back of your mind so that when we do look at these works in more detail, you'll already be set up to kind of think about them. So in this idea of courage, for instance, when we look at the poem Beowulf, right, we're going to come across a very important scene where Beowulf, the aged king, goes in alone into a cave to fight a dragon. So one of the questions when thinking about his heroism is this a rash action? Or would it have been cowardice not to? Or perhaps it was only rash that he chose to go in alone, but not that he chose to fight the dragon. It would have been cowardice to do otherwise. Or perhaps, because he was so aged, it was rashness to fight the dragon at all, and doubly rash that he would do it alone. That's kind of what we're talking about. All right, so in the sphere of pleasure and pain, right, an excess of pleasure is licentiousness, and a deficiency is insensibility. But the mean is temperance. So, for instance, when we read A Man for All Seasons, it'd be worth thinking about the relationship between King Henry VIII of England and Thomas More. Is Thomas More insensible? Right? Is he actually too removed from pleasure, or is he actually temperate? Is Henry VIII temperate, or is he licentious? Does he overindulge in pleasure? In the sphere of action or feeling, we have also getting and spending in a kind of minor sense. So an excess of that is prodigality, right? And a deficiency is illiberality. The mean is liberality. So when we look at Shakespeare's Henry V, for instance, we will have the character of the Dauphin, who is the prince, son of the king of France, and Henry V, king of England. It might be worth looking at the way they treat their followers, right? Does one fall into illiberality? Does he not reward like he should? Or does one fall into prodigality, right? And spend in a way that is in fact not particularly worthy of a hero, you could say, perhaps. You could also possibly use that same example for another example of getting and spending, the excess of which is vulgarity and the deficiency is pettiness, right? And the mean is magnificence. Again, do either of the young royal figures, the Dauphin and Henry V, do they show off their wealth and power in a way that is vulgar, right? Or are either of them petty? Despite their wealth and power, they do not share it. Or is Hal an example of magnificence? Is he a magnificent hero in that sense? Then we have the sphere of honor and dishonor. in the major sense, right? Where the excess is vanity, the deficiency is pusillanimity, and the mean is magnanimity. So again, to use an example from A Man for All Seasons, think about when we get to that text, Henry VIII, right? Is there a deficiency there, or is there excess? Is it vanity, the way that he uh, interacts with his own honor as king, or is he actually hitting the mean and is magnanimous? All right, then we have this kind of another sphere of honor and dishonor in a more minor sense, where an excess is ambition, a deficiency is unambitiousness, and the mean is proper ambition, right? So this one's a little bit harder to figure out. But again, you could think about that with regards to Henry V, Shakespeare. Is his ambition to conquer France, to become the king of France, is that an excess of ambition? Would a young king who did not act in that way, would that actually be a deficiency? Would that be unambitiousness? In other words, what is proper ambition? And where does it fall? In the sphere of anger, right, we have an excess, which is irascibility, and a deficiency, which is a lack of spirit. But the mean is patience. So again, going back to A Man for All Seasons, is Thomas More irascible? Right? Is he getting too angry over what the king is asking of him to do in that play, or does he suffer from a lack of spirit? Is the kind of reaction that he shows an example of the mean? Is that a proper patience? And thus he's a good example of a kind of patient hero that will be worth thinking about. In the realm of self-expression, you have an excess, which is boastfulness, and you have a deficiency, which is understatement. The mean is truthfulness. So when we look at Beowulf, at the end, really, the last thing we'll be looking at in this discussion of heroes, you'll see that Beowulf does seem to boast of his exploits, right? So is he falling into that excess there? Or in the context, would it actually be deficiency? Would it be an understatement if he didn't talk about what he had done? Is he simply being truthful? And where we categorize that, where we place it in this table, may affect how we view, how we see his heroism. Keeping with that text, right, in the next one we have moral conduct. Or sorry, next one we have conversation, actually. An excess is buffoonery, and a deficiency is boorishness. But right, there's the clown, and there's the antisocial person. But the mean is wittiness. So to go back to Beowulf, when he enters the hall, as you'll see when we look at the poem, right, he'll get into an argument, it seems, with a character called Unfair, who seems to kind of be matching wits with Beowulf. And it might be worth thinking about that character of Unfair. Is that wittiness? Is that actually the mean? Or is he straying beyond the mean? All right, so then again, we have social conduct. So excess of social conduct is obsequiousness, right? A kind of servile, fawning kind of thing. And a deficiency is cantankerousness, right? The mean in between those two things is friendliness. A good example to possibly think about that in our upcoming text that we'll be looking at is in Henry V, when King Henry is approached by the French herald. Right? What is the interaction like between these characters? Is one cantankerous? Is one too obsequious? Do they have a friendliness even though they are technically enemies? Right, then we have the sphere of shame, right? We have an excess of shame, which would be a shyness. And here it is kind of used in a more pejorative sense. And a deficiency, of course, is shamelessness. But the mean is modesty. So when we look at the medieval saint's life of St. Margaret, for instance, how is that character's behavior framed within the narrative. In other words, does it seem like there's an excess there? Or does it seem like an excess to us, but it's treated as though it is the mean? Right? That will be worth thinking about. Right? And then we have the sphere of indignation. Right? So an excess of indignation would be envy, and a deficiency would be a malicious enjoyment. But the mean is righteous indignation. Now, a potential example of that, to go back again to Beowulf, right, I was talking about how there's this character Unferth who's going to interact with the main character Beowulf and will kind of challenge him. Right? Does he envy Beowulf? Or maybe he takes a malicious enjoyment in the woes of Beowulf, or is there a righteous indignation in what Beowulf has done? Or perhaps Beowulf is the one that is in the mean here that has a righteous indignation. Right? These are all examples of how these things are functioning. Now, if you haven't read these texts yet, it may be hard to kind of situate what these are, but I think if I've described them clearly, that you should have some kind of idea, right? The idea between being indignant at something that you ought to be, as opposed to envying it. The idea of being modest, but not overly shy or too shameless. Certainly the idea of being friendly, but not being fawning or not being grumpy. The idea of being witty, not being ignorant, but also not being a clown. The idea of being truthful in your conversation, but not leaving things out that you shouldn't, but also not boasting. The idea of being patient, but not lacking that kind of drive or being too quick to hurry up. The idea of having a proper ambition to attain your goals, but not too much, and not being unambitious or slothful. The idea of being generous, but not to the point of giving away too much, nor of holding it in like a miser. Right? The idea of not being petty, but also not being vulgar. The idea of not being vain, but also not caring. Right? The idea of not being overly indulgent in, say, food or drink, but also not being puritanical. The idea of that temperance. And the one that perhaps will prove the most important in a discussion of the heroic is not being rash and not being a coward, but instead hitting that mean of courage. Now, perhaps for this one of courage, I will give another example. Imagine that a man finds that his barn is on fire. It's engulfed in flames. And he charges into the burning building. Right? Scales the ladder as everything is collapsing around him in flames. Right? His clothes are starting to get fire. His flesh is starting to burn. He gets up into the hayloft, right, suffering third-degree burns, and saves his pet mouse. Is that rash? Would he have been a coward not to run in? Is that an example of courage? Well, it seems that for the purposes of a pet mouse, that suffering horrific burns over your body, maybe to the point that he can't even work properly anymore, would not actually be a proper object. That was rash, right? That he should have feared the effects of the fire and have prudently withdrawn. This idea of prudence being one of the kind of governing factors that keeps a character in the mean. Now, if he had gone in to save his child, well, then that would be courage, right? And cowardice would be the deficiency if he had not gone in. And this is important. So one of the things I said at the very beginning of this discussion was that Aristotle is moving towards particulars in a way that Plato is moving towards universals. And you can kind of see how that's true. Right? We're looking at the particulars of genre, right? What makes something a play or a poem, and also looking at this idea of the hero and heroes that have tragic flaws, and also this idea of the golden mean, right? All of these ways. It is very particular. However, that does not mean that we want to fall into what we were trying to avoid when looking at Plato, which is that we do not want to fall into plot summary or plot description. In other words, simply looking at the mechanics of the action of a particular character in a narrative without thinking about larger ideas. For instance, larger ideas of heroism. Well, this would be an example where we have an action, right, running into a burning building, that we might be tempted to automatically categorize as heroic. After all, charging into a burning building, surely that must be heroic. But if we apply Aristotle's matrix, we could call it, you'll find that this isn't simply a kind of moral prescription. Indeed, it is not even necessarily moral, at least in the sense that we might think about it, right? It really is a matter of prudential judgment based on the end that is to be obtained. So in the example I just gave, right, the end of saving a mouse is not a sufficient end to risk such grievous bodily harm as horrific burns all over your body, whereas saving your own child, or any child, would be. So the mechanics running into a burning building have not changed. The action itself is unchanged. It's the end of what is trying to be achieved. Now that is going to be very important to consider when we begin looking at these so-called heroic texts. So in other words, don't simply look at what the character does to determine what he is, where he's falling in a kind of spectrum of virtue or vice, but also think about what is the character trying to achieve, right? And is the character employing an excess to achieve it, or are they suffering from a deficiency, or are they hitting the mean exactly? And one of the reasons why it could be very useful to use Aristotle, not only generally for literary analysis, but specifically when analyzing heroic action and trying to determine, is it heroic? Is the character a hero? If so, what kind of hero? How are we defining hero if we use that character in a heroic way? You'll remember in the video where I talked about heroism, we have a whole spectrum of definitions, ranging from the original Greek one, which is a character of more than human strength and ability, a demigod, to definitions which presuppose that the actions taken by the hero are noble and they're laudable. That is kind of going to be the working basis for our discussion of heroism. Now we can massage it a bit, we can play with it, but we're going to be assuming that when we refer to a character as a hero, that we are indicating that there's something in that character that is laudable or noble. Now, that does not mean, though, that the character is not also a character with faults. So, for instance, in Aristotle's tragic hero, there has to be something noble there for him to be the hero, and yet there has to be that flaw, right? That tragic flaw, which undermines the character. And if that is how we are discussing the hero, then it means we are essentially conceiving of the hero as a hero that, at least ideally, has some kind of virtue. It may also have vices. And that is where this matrix of Aristotle, of the golden mean, of the virtue and vice, of excess and deficiency, can come in quite handy. So I spoke in the last video with regards to Plato about how Plato can help us not fall into the trap of plot description and plot summary, right? Of simply looking at the mechanical elements of what the character does and not thinking about the larger idea of heroism. But there is another trap that one could easily fall into, and that would be, when discussing heroism, to simply define a hero according to one's own personal reflection. In other words, perhaps you are a pacifist, in which case, if we were reading a text where one of the characters goes to war, right? You could simply say, well, they're not a hero because I don't believe in war, and so I don't think it's laudable. So I reject that as being a heroic character to me personally. Or, oh, or I do think that war is a good thing, and this character goes to war, and so it aligns with my personal beliefs, and so I think the character is a hero. In other words, your analysis of the character and whether or not they can be conceived of as heroic is entirely personal and entirely based on your own feelings, your own reflections. Now, there's multiple problems here. One, of course, is that there could be a disjunct between the world of the narrative and the world in which you occupy. In other words, the character may be clearly heroic in the narrative, but is simply occupying a different kind of moral space than you do. And that can lead to a disjunct that can make analysis difficult. The other problem, of course, is that there doesn't appear to be enough of an objective basis. In other words, if your definitions of whether or not something is heroic or whether or not a character is a hero or what kind of hero is entirely personal, entirely based on your own feelings, then that's not really the kind of thing that you can demonstrate. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, if we're all coming at these texts together and then simply responding to them based on our own personal feeling, we can't actually have a real discussion. Right? If one person thinks that a character is a hero because of their personal feelings, and another person thinks that their character is not a hero because of their personal feelings, then how can the two meet? Well, one way that people can kind of come together and discuss things in a very fruitful way is if you have a shared set of terms, you have a shared philosophical viewpoint at which you're approaching things, and you're using certain, at least nearly objective standards. Now, of course, we can all have different takes on what each of these words means that Aristotle is using here to describe the mean. And indeed, we can even challenge whether or not what he calls the mean is indeed the mean. Maybe you think that there is no proper ambition, right? Ambition is, you could argue for that. But the point is that this Aristotelian matrix, as I'm calling it, will hopefully help us approach the literature in a more objective fashion. So that just as, like Plato, right, we're looking at the universal idea, the ideal of heroism, and not falling into plot summary or plot description. So with Aristotle, we can avoid falling into simple personal reflection. But by applying this matrix, we can look and say, all right, what are the character's vices? In what ways is the character deficient? In what ways is the character indulging in excess? Where does the character hit the mean? Now, by doing that, we could maybe challenge whether or not a character is a hero at all. We could also help to categorize, if they are a hero, what kind of a hero. Are they a tragic hero? What kind of hamartia do they suffer from? What is their tragic flaw? Where do they miss the mark? Once we understand that, we'll also be able to understand the narrative more broadly. For if we know where the character misses the mark, we know not only more about the character itself, but we also know more about how the narrative functions. Again, it is Hamlet's vacillation, for instance, that leads to the way the plot of Hamlet unfolds. So moving from that, I would like to suggest a particular approach, an approach which will hopefully be useful for you. In the text that we will be looking at over the next several months, I would suggest that you try and identify what the hero of that particular literary work is, in your estimation. And try to apply this Aristotelian matrix. In other words, try to analyze the character and see what their vices are. Again, where are they deficient? Where do they fall into excess? And if they hit the mean. And if they hit the mean, where they hit it. Where they hit the mean, that may help you identify what kind of a hero the character is, if the character is indeed a hero, or so it seems. Where they miss the mark, you can either possibly have so many that it leads you to the conclusion that the character isn't actually a hero at all, but it may also, rather than doing that, help you to see where the hero, even if they are still a hero, goes wrong, and how that affects the nature of the narrative. In other words, is, say, when we get to A Man for All Seasons, is it Thomas More's deficiency in spirit, right, that ultimately leads to the problem? Or is it an irascibility? This will be very useful when you are engaging in literary analysis yourself, because again, you will have a basis to actually analyze character and to analyze the narrative in a way which will hopefully be quite fruitful for you. Now, some of the texts that we will be looking at will lend themselves to this more than others. So, for instance, right, a play like A Man for All Seasons or Henry V may quite easily fall into this matrix. We have a very clear protagonist, a very clear main character, and a character which clearly performs actions which are at least considered laudable, but also by some characters in the play and not laudable by others. So in this way, it should be quite easy to apply. But other texts may prove much more difficult. For instance, we will be looking at J.R.R. Tolkien's Farmer Giles of Ham, right, which is a very kind of funny and amusing story. So when dealing with something that's humorous, does this still apply, or does this break down? In a couple of weeks, we'll be looking at Flutey's Convocation Address, right, which is, right, it's a convocation address. It's nonfiction, describing his time in a communist concentration camp in Hungary in the 1950s. Right? Is that applicable here? Nonfiction, right? It's a speech. He's relating a real story. It's not following the normal structures of a heroic narrative. I mean, it's about people in the concentration camp. You know, can we apply this or not? Perhaps the most difficult text to which you would try to apply this would be the very first literary text that we will look at, which is Stories from the Six Worlds, right? Which is a series of Mi'kmaq myths. Why could it be very difficult to apply this? Well, for a whole bunch of reasons. First and foremost, myths are always difficult. Even if you look at ancient Greek myths, the kind with which Aristotle would have been familiar, it would be very difficult. Not only do the gods act in ways that usually are not in accord with traditional morality, but even characters like Hercules, right, do not necessarily always act in ways which we would consider to be kind of standard behavior for heroes. But of course, we're dealing with a mythology from the Mi'kmaq people, which is not a part of the Greco-Roman tradition. It's from a different tradition, and it's going to have different kinds of cultural manifestations when it comes to heroes. Moreover, it was originally oral. The myths that we'll be looking at were, of course, written down by a scholar, but they were written down from oral accounts from traditional Mi'kmaq storytellers. Now, oral tales are going to have less structure, or at least they'll be less systematized than a story that was written by a single author, for instance. We're going to see that at the end with Beowulf as well. So in these oral tales, right, things will happen that simply don't seem to follow in the same kind of way that we would expect from a more traditional Western narrative. As such, it may be more difficult to see how we can apply this matrix So, for instance, if in a tragedy it's clear how you can identify the tragic flaw of the tragic hero, how that tragic flaw leads to the termination of the plot in some kind of tragic ending. And in the oral tale, you may not be able to see that. Assuming that you can find a tragic flaw at all, which is debatable, it may not be clear how that actually mechanically results in what happens later. Indeed, sometimes it may seem like the elements of the tale are simply thrown together, and that there is not a clear relationship between the two. Finally, we are dealing with something that in the Mi'kmaq myths which originates from a almost primordial past. In other words, even a ancient Greek tragedy, thousands of years old, is still the product of a society which is perhaps somewhat recognizable to us, created by a professional playwright, perhaps, who lived in a city, and it was performed civically before other citizens of the city. Maybe they were living in a democracy. Right? There's all these kinds of points of contact that help us as the reader to see what the text is doing. But in the case of a myth like the Mi'kmaq myths, which we'll be looking at next week, they're originating from a world that is very foreign probably to most of us. Again, it's almost like it's a world before time, a world where spiritual powers and supernatural occurrences are simply a part of everyday life, and that there is no disjunct between the shape changer and the kind of hero of the story. Moreover, as we will see in the introduction to these myths, right, it can be argued that the traditional categories, particularly in the moral sense of good and bad, good and evil, simply do not apply. Now, if these categories do not apply, then how is it that we, in fact, can apply this matrix, or can we? It's possible that we cannot. It's possible that this Aristotelian matrix, as useful as it is for the analysis of more traditional or more canonical Western literature, in fact, has to be abandoned when dealing with something like the myths of the Mi'kmaq people. But it's possible that it could still act as a kind of rudder to direct you on the treacherous seas of literary inquiry. In other words, if you're reading the Mi'kmaq myths and you are lost, right, you can't determine anything about what's going on. You can maybe you can determine who the hero is, but they don't seem to be acting in a way that is familiar to you. Maybe it doesn't seem logical or rational. Maybe it just doesn't seem to be good. Perhaps you can apply not only Aristotle, but Plato as well. If you recall, the effigies, the things casting the shadows on the wall in the allegory of the cave, they were really convention. So perhaps you can leave behind some of the conventions of heroism with which you're familiar. And again, move beyond the shadows on the wall, the mere things, mechanical things that the character is doing in the tales. And you can move towards that ideal of heroism, divorced from conventions, and it'll open you up to considering an idea of a hero that's very, very different from what you're familiar with. But maybe you can also apply Aristotle. Even if the actions of the character, perhaps, for instance, don't seem particularly moral, existing in a very different kind of world from the one you're familiar with, maybe at least you can use this matrix to help you, right? Is there a deficiency, for instance? Is there a lack of spirit in the character, or is there an excess, right? Does it seem within the construct of the narrative that without the action that the character takes, that they would be not living up to what they are trying to get at? And let me give you a bit of a tangible example to kind of wrap up here. One of the things that you see in Mi'kmaq myths is a lot of myths are related to the young hero, perhaps we can call him, having to go find a wife. Now, perhaps that doesn't strike one as a particularly heroic thing to do. However, if we look at the narrative, we may be able to get a sense of the world in which the character occupies. Now, if in that world it would be deficiency to not marry and have children, then possibly that character is hitting the mean. And it's not actually excess. On the other hand, perhaps the hero is going out to achieve this means via war. Perhaps in that war, right, you see the hero acting in such a way that is far more brutal and violent than other characters around them. In which case, we could say, well, there's an excess there. And again, an excess not just because of one's own conventions of the heroic, but excess because within the structure itself, we see this function. So I would like you all to keep in mind this idea of, again, the end. What do the characters in the works that we will be looking at, what do they want? What are they trying to achieve? And how are they going about achieving it? Because this will help us place it somewhere on this table of vices and virtues. And again, if we are establishing together that the hero is laudable and noble, possibly deeply flawed as well, but nevertheless possessing these qualities, these heroic qualities, then a vicious character, a character that is consumed by the vices of their passions, right, is perhaps going to be one that we would not, in our discussion, want to place with the other characters, which are more heroic. But it's of course possible as well that a character who perhaps does not seem virtuous on the face of it, within the context of the narrative in which they inhabit, will actually come out when we use this table as a heroic character of some kind. So as you approach the very first thing that we'll be looking at, these myths of the Mi'kmaq people, I would like you to keep this in mind. I would like you to read them as though you were leaving the conventions which you are familiar with behind, as though you are entering into the world that these characters inhabit, right? That you are not simply like a foreign observer who's critiquing what they're doing, but that you are actually a participant in the story. At the end of this, you should have some conception of what a hero is in literature, but also how culture affects it. So in other words, you don't have to come in entirely from your own culture, if you can help it. But at the same time, we are all products of our own culture. We all have heroic conventions which we are familiar with. But remember that image of the burning building. Running into the burning building may seem inherently heroic. It depends why you're running in there. So think about character intention. Think about character motivation. Right? Think about what the character wants. Because that may determine the ideal of heroism to which they aspire. And that ideal may determine how we, as the analyzers of these works, categorize them. The hero itself may not always be a fixed thing in what we're looking at, but we can fix it together in such a way that we are all coming at it from the same point of view. And for that, Aristotle is very useful. We move towards the particulars with Aristotle, while also keeping in mind that we're moving towards the universals of Plato and trying to grasp some conception of what it means to be a hero in literature and in culture.